Hi everyone, it's Harry here again with, I guess this time it's a VFX tutorial. Um, Now this is I guess it's a fire tornado, inspired by recent Slow-Mo Guys video, if you've seen that one. If not, I'll leave a link to it in the description. So this is a little entirely node-based shader. I mean, it's Nodevember. Prompt was red for this one, so I figured why not? It kind of works with both. So, so this is the graph we're using here. I'm just going to go through a few of the bits in brief detail, and then we'll go over each bit individually. So to start with, we're taking our texture coordinates of our cylinder, and we are deforming them using these set of parameters and this custom material function to give us these texture coordinates that scroll up left and also have this diagonal slant. So you can see the UVs here and the effects they'd have on the texture here. But instead we're using a procedural noise node to give us this scrolling 3D noise that changes over time, using another another time input here combined with the texture coordinates. We're then using that and these thresholds to create a mask of the areas that we want to be fire and not. We're then using a couple of functions here to create some edge highlights, so that the outer parts of the fire are a bit more intense than the middle. This is all parameterized, so you can change it. We're then using this mask here to drive the color inputs using this linear gradient. So the color base you can see at the bottom, color top you see at the top, and you're just using a lerp and multiply to drive the colors. We're then also using this original noise here to drive some world position offset here. So this material is translucent surface. It's unlit because we don't need to worry about it receiving illumination. It's two-sided, so you can see the back face of this cylinder. And also if we scroll down here, we are using tessellation, and that's what's giving us this warping effect. Otherwise we just have a very static looking cylinder here, which doesn't look too good. So this is all the warping setup. We're essentially taking our texture input, and so the brighter elements stick out further and the darker elements are sort of pinched inwards, and we're also using this gradient so that it sort of pinches towards the center. That's all drivable. And then right at the end we're multiplying it by the object scale, because this gives us a vector 3 from vertex normals, multiplying it by scale to make sure that regardless of how big we scale the cylinder, the offsets that we're using are always going to make sense. Otherwise, if you scale this down to very small sizes, because these offsets are in world space, it'll pinch everything in and overlap within itself, and you get some nasty effects. Finally, we're using a Fresnel effect. This is what gives us the effect of the brighter edges. So Fresnel basically means meshes pointing 90 degrees away from you have a value of 1, and stuff pointing directly at you has a value of 0 or close to 0. And so that's why we have this sort of edge effect here. And any elements that sort of curve using the offset naturally have more of a intense Fresnel effect, so it works quite nicely with this. And then we're reusing some other stuff like this linear gradient here to just fade out the opacity at the top, so that it goes from more intense to less intense at the top. So let's go over some stuff in more detail. So firstly, how are we making these coordinates set up here? So we've got this custom material function here, taking all these parameters in. Essentially, what this does is it takes your time coordinate, and if I put this back to square preview, it multiplies the time by this input parameter, and this gives you the sort of movement in the positive x direction. So this is the rate that you're scrolling this way, if you can see the mouse. Now in the preview, this is set to 0.1, so it should go from left to right over the period of about 10 seconds. That's how it lines up. The twist, this is what gives you this diagonal offset, the slanting, and that's achieved by taking this gradient here from bottom to top and essentially just adding it to your x-coordinate. So essentially what this means is your x-coordinate gets offset the further up you go. Now for the y-coordinate, essentially we're just taking the same time data and just multiplying it by a different scalar rate. So this is the rate at which the texture climbs up the screen. So we're appending x onto y, and then just here we're essentially taking the remainder of this, so it's all in the 0 to 1 space. It just makes it a lot easier to preview what's happening with the UVs, because otherwise, as you can see here, it gets very washed out. So this is what it looks like. This is the effect it has on the texture, and we're essentially using this as the input for a procedural noise node, but we're also adding in this extra parameter here, and this is what lets us change the noise over time. So if I just plug this in, you can see we get this scrolling noise texture. It's scrolling diagonally, but it's not changing over time. Honestly, the effect still looks fairly good. The movement is enough that it kind of disguises the fact that it's not changing. But if you want a bit more sort of wild-looking flames, then this is again just plugging in the time data multiplied by a scalar to get it changing over time. As I mentioned before, this is essentially just taking, if you imagine your 3D noise, the noise that's generated being like a cube. Essentially, the value we're appending is just taking a different vertical slice out of this cube as we go scroll through, and because it exists in like 0 to 1 space, it'll loop through the same sort of set of noise. So let's put this back to what it was. Alright, so we've got our vector 2 here. We're appending on a scalar value here, which gives us vector 3, and we're using that in the noise node. We're using a scale of 2. You can set the scale to whatever you want, but try to keep your repeat size as the same as the scale. Otherwise you'll get a very obvious sort of mirroring effect in your texture, and it will be very obvious with the two-sided mesh that we've got going on here. So our outputs are between 0 and 1, which means that the darkest pixel here will be 0, the brightest will be 1. Makes it quite nice and easy to deal with. And we're using Voronoi noise in this case. Just personal preference. You can try other ones if that's what you want. So we then have this essentially this mask for fire. We're then multiplying it by this gradient here. We're taking a vertical gradient. Essentially, that will go from 1 to 0. And then we're multiplying it by this value and saturating it. Saturating is a clamp between 0 and 1, which basically gives us this slight fade off in the last sort of 10% of the texture. And you can see as we apply this, we get this sort of fade at the top. This just stops any harsh edges. You could apply this to the bottom of the mesh as well if you wanted a sort of gradual fade, but the assumption is that this will be contained within some other object or have some other particle system for the origin of a fire at the bottom. But again, you can just apply a similar mask onto here, just again multiply it on top of the original. So we're taking this, again, clamp between 0 and 1, doing this a lot just to make things easier to deal with, and then we're subtracting this threshold which takes away from this one. You can see we've got these darker values here. And this is essentially just saying what areas do we want as the fire, what areas do we want as empty space between them. And this is changeable as well. We're then multiplying it here by this contrast value, and this just gives us essentially a 0 or 1 mask. Obviously it's not exactly 0 or 1. There will be some slight fade at the edge, but this is basically just to give us an alpha mask for the fire, which we'll use later. Now, at the same time, we're using this saturated mask here, and we're renormalizing it using this alpha threshold, because at the moment we're taking it here is 0 to 1. We're subtracting 0.3, which gives us 0 to 0.7, and this we're essentially dividing back by the inverse to give us a 0 to 1 range again. Whenever you're doing multiplication maths on these sort of masks, it's always easier to work in a 0 to 1 space. It just means that it's a lot more predictable in terms of the outputs. So we've got our two masks here, and here we're creating some edge highlights. So what we do here is we take this texture and we subtract its inverse from it, and that gives us this effect where the middle of the flames is most intense, and then we multiply that back by its original mask, which gives us this edge highlight effect. We're then raising that to a power. Now this is quite dark just because of the nature of this is already a dark image. If you multiply a value of less than 1 by itself, it's going to be much closer to 0. So we're just multiplying it back by this value to bring it approximately back into 0 to 1 again. And then what we're doing is we're taking this texture, we're adding it back on to itself, the edge highlights, with this opacity value. So this means we can separately control the edge highlights compared to the centers of the fire. So it's all independently controllable. So this is what it looks like with the dither enabled. You can see you get these sort of almost like an after image based on the previous frames. It gives it sort of this strange sort of almost sort of dusty like pixelated effect. It's an interesting look, but for me I'm going to leave it disabled. Obviously you just stick this node in if you want to use it. Alright, so now that we've got this mask with the edge and the base of the fire, then we use a linear gradient from bottom to top again, and put that through a lerp function, and using these two colors gives us this nice gradient from the bottom to top, which you can see in the material itself. We then multiply by this emissive intensity to give it a bit more brightness. We also use this Fresnel effect here, and this is what gives us the highlights at the edge. Basically means if a part of a mesh is pointing away from 90 degrees from the camera, it will show up brighter than the mesh that's pointing directly at you. And you can change the effect here. Essentially we're just taking this color input, multiplying it by the Fresnel effect, and we're also doing the same for this alpha mask, just multiplying by the same amount. And then we're also using the same gradient from 1 to 0 to give us sort of an opacity fade out, so it's the colour's more solid at the bottom and it fades out towards the top, which you can kind of see in that texture there. We're also, as we're using a mesh with tessellation on, we are using vertex positions here. So essentially we take this original noise here. You can use a different noise for this, but if you can reuse existing noise assets, it's going to make the shader less complicated, obviously, because each of these will add a lot of instructions. You can see here the vertex shader, 414 instructions. That's quite a lot. That's sort of a medium complexity if we were to preview this in scene mode. So we take this noise, which is from 0 to 1, and then we just convert it to -1 to 1. Now this is so we get the noise both pulls in on the mesh and pushes out. So it's not just making it wider or making it narrower in all cases. You get a sort of a balance between the two. We're then adding this gradient here, which goes from the moment 0 at the bottom to 1 in the middle and then back to 0. And that's controlled by this pinch parameter here, which gives us, in fact, the sort of the curve inwards and then back out again. This is just a feature from, if you've ever actually seen one of these fire tornadoes, it appears to have that kind of effect. So this is just attempting to mimic that. Obviously you can change this as required. You can put different gradients in there if you want different effects. If you want it to go entirely outwards, you could just have a gradient from, say, 0 to 1, which would have a sort of a cone shape. So we multiply that by -1. So this is subtracting from the mesh, so it goes inwards again. And then we're multiplying it by the vertex normal data. So if we have a quick look at the cylinder object itself, and we look at its normals, essentially that takes each of these normals in the direction it's pointing here, takes their orientation in world space, and then that means that whenever we're using this noise, which is basically just a scalar value for each point, that means that each point is being transformed relative to its vertex normal, which means we get all the points uniformly in or out through their position on the mesh. If we didn't have this, every vertex would be translated in the positive x, y, or z direction, so it will be going sort of diagonally upwards, and that gives some weird effects. This is just to make everything in the correct direction. We then multiply this by another gradient. This is designed to give less warping at the bottom and more warping at the top. So this is again a 0 to 1 gradient. We're just reusing the existing nodes, inverting it, and then putting it through a lerp. Now you can't really see this because any previews above the value of 1 just get washed out. So this is from strength of 2 at the bottom to strength of 5, and you can see there's a lot more sort of oscillation and flames up there. We then multiply that all through, and then at the end we multiply by the object scale. This is a node you can just put into your graphs, and that just basically takes whatever scale. If we go back to this test scene, you can see the scale here is 1, 1, 1. If I were to set this to say 10, 10, 10, the offset would all be multiplied by that scalar amount, so it should look the same regardless of what size it is. And that means if you were to also shrink the mesh down, because all of these offsets are in world space, the WS, that prevents you from getting odd effects occurring. So we take that and we just plug that into the world position offset. Now at the moment, if we look at the brush wireframe, you can see there's quite a lot of details on this mesh through the amount of tessellation that we're doing. Even though this is the resolution of the mesh, each of these is one vertex. We get a lot more resolution using this tessellation option down here. You might not need this amount of tessellation. The base mesh might be enough if you're not doing particularly intense warping, in which case you can turn this off and probably save yourself a little bit of performance. But in this case, essentially, we're parameterizing all of this. So if I save this, I've created this material instance up here. So because these are all parameterized, you can change these on an individual basis. And if you want to test different settings, these work a lot faster than recompiling the entire material. So for example, we could just change the color, preview updates immediately, get some nice combinations with some of these. Let's try inverting these, go from orange to purple. That'd be cool. You can also, because these work as essentially high dynamic range colors, you can change the value here. So if we change this to 5, it is essentially the same color, but that much more intense. So if you want a higher emission value on, say, the bottom compared to the top, you could change this to, say, 1 and this to, say, 10, and you'll get that contrast. But if you just want to change the whole intensity together, you can use the emissive intensity feature here, and that will be reflected in the scene. This is just a scene with a black plane and black background. So you can also change things like the Fresnel strength. I think it looks quite good with 1. A pinch value obviously is how much it goes into the middle. If we turn it up to something like 2, that was the wrong one. That's because I changed the emissive intensity, no, the Fresnel strength. If we change that to 10, you can see it pinches in so much that it actually goes all the way through. So probably, yeah, so about 2, pinch down to essentially almost nothing in the middle. Does look quite cool looking down there. So I left that as 1 for now. So the alpha threshold is essentially how much of the original texture is culled away. So if we actually preview this on a square mesh, now it's a little bit difficult to preview just because of the Fresnel strength. So if we turn that up to, say, 5, make it a bit brighter, you can see there's the scrolling noise going, actually it should be that way. You can change the alpha threshold. If it's 0, essentially almost all of the flame is kept, like nothing is culled. If we turn that up to 1, obviously everything is culled. 0.9 you get very little, and obviously with the actual cylinder mesh you don't really get much, although it is an interesting sort of wispy effect here. So 0.3 to 0.4 seems to work fairly well. 0.4 will give you slightly larger holes between the flames. Contrast is just used for masking. You probably don't need to touch that. The edge opacity is just for the edge highlights. So if the edge and flame opacity are both 1, then essentially your opacity will just be controlled by the Fresnel. Although if we drop this down to 0, you can see essentially the flames almost become sort of empty. You only get the edge information. If we turn it up to, say, 0.5, you get sort of midway between the two. Now the vertical fade strength is how much of this is cut away. So a lower value means the gradient is multiplied less. So the 0 to 1 range will be from essentially here to here. And the higher you put this, essentially the higher up the mesh can go. So you can just change this until you get a value you like the look of. Somewhere around 5 is probably good. So the tornado variables here are all controlling the actual rotation and the flame movement. So a value of 1 is how fast upwards they go with climb. So obviously if it was 0, you'll just have the noise moving over time. If I set these all to 0, you can probably see what's going on. So as I increase this, you can see it's climbing slowly. If we set this to 1, this is the speed the noise actually changes. So that looks quite good. Set that to 1 again. We have all 1.2 for now. Make a slower one. Spin rate, obviously, how fast it goes in a clockwise direction. And the twist is how much the texture coordinates are slanted diagonally. So 1 is essentially a 90-degree slant, and you'll probably want to tweak these values based on the other ones, so that the spin looks sort of more intuitive in terms of how the flames are actually moving. Turn the opacity back up, and this warp strength is essentially the minimum will be at the bottom of the mesh, so how much it's warped here. So if we set these to 0, we get no warping whatsoever. If we set these both to 1, get a small amount of warping at both the top and the bottom. You can turn it all the way up and get some quite strange results. I think perhaps up to maybe 8 or so you can probably get away with without it clipping into itself too much. Yeah, all of these variables designed to be tweakable, so you can play around with the colours and do whatever you want. And I think that is essentially it for this preview. I will try and package up this as an asset, and I will host this on my website, links in the description, or on Google Drive, whatever ends up being easier. Now if you find this tutorial useful, let me know in the comments if you've got any suggestions for improving it, either making it look more realistic, or if you've got some interesting stylized effects. I'd love to see it. If you think you can make it better, yeah, I mean, it's 300, 400 instructions. It's not particularly, if we look at shading complexity, give it a second to compile, it's not usually great in terms of, yeah, so you can see the vertex shader is in the bad end of things. That's just due to the amount of displacement we're doing. And the pixel shader, which is the colors and the emission, that's also in the bad range. Now most of this, you can see if we look down this bit, this is actually because it's a two-sided mesh, and we're actually looking through, essentially the shader is doubled in these regions, which is why it's particularly bad. Just for one is not so bad. So yeah, there's probably some optimization that can be done, but for now, if this is just a single effect, unless you're having like multiple of these on the screen at the same time, or using it for like a stacked particle system, it's probably fine. You could probably add some particles to this to make it look a bit more interesting, but for now, this is all I'm going to do for this. So yeah, again, if you want to copy any of this, use it in your own work, feel free. So I hope some of you found this useful. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.